This is Flare and Flow by The Legend of Chell on AO3. Chapter 13, Embers. Keith and Lance were still staring into the inner sanctum when Lance's uncle and his guards finally broke through. "This is an outrage," Chief Baku spat, storming over to the Avatar. Lance automatically moved between them like a shield, but Keith placed a hand on Lance's arm and stepped forward. "Where is the Blue Lion?" Keith asked, and a shiver ran down Lance's spine. Normally, when Keith lost his temper, he became a spitfire, but this time his words were made of chilling ice. Baku seemed similarly affected, blanching a bit before regaining his fury. "I don't see how you have any right to be asking me questions when you are the one trespassing. Avatar or not, this is unacceptable." Lance saw Laura and the mysterious woman enter the room out of the corner of his eye. Keith merely stared back at the chief coldly. "Where," he repeated, "is the Blue Lion?" Baku drew himself up as his face turned purple. "If you think I'll be letting you see her now after all of this, where," rage seeped into Keith's voice, "is the Blue Lion?" "I don't," Baku quailed under the fierce glare as his eyes filled with uncertainty. I didn't mean, it's just, Uncle," Lance said in a low voice. His hands shook as his fingernails dug crestons into his palms as he tried to keep his calm. "What have you done?" Baku's eyes darted between Lance and the others. He turned to his guards. "Leave us." "But sire, I said leave us," he snapped. The guards reluctantly exited the sanctum, leaving the chief alone with Lance, Keith, Alora, and the mysterious woman. After a long silence, Baku's shoulders sagged, as if all the fight had been pulled from his body. "The Blue Lion has been missing for 3 months. Lance squeezed his eyes shut. He had known something was wrong, but this was the worst-case scenario come true. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Lance growled. "I didn't want to start a panic," his uncle said. "The people were in an uproar when the White Lion vanished. What do you think would happen if they learned our own lion was gone now too? It would be mass chaos." To everyone's surprise, it was the woman who acted next. She grabbed Chief Baku by the front of his robes and held Keith's knife up to his neck. Lance moved forward, but a hand on his elbow stopped him. When he glanced back, Keith shook his head slightly. "Do you mean to tell me," she snarled as Baku scrubbed to get away, "that I've been guarding an empty room for 3 months? "You didn't know?" Keith asked. "I'm not a waterbender, so I couldn't get inside. I had to settle for making sure no one else did either." She narrowed her eyes, grip not budging as Baku continued to squirm. "I've been keeping watch over this place for nearly 5 years, and I know for a fact that in all of that time, no one has gone in or out except for you. So how could the lion disappear?" "I don't know," the chief replied shakily. "One day I came in and she was just gone." A low growl emitted from her throat as she pressed the dagger harder into his skin. "Please, I swear it's the truth." Lance's muscles tensed as he prepared to intervene, but Keith beat him to it. "Stop," he commanded the woman. "I believe him." She eyed Baku suspiciously for another moment, but released her hold and stepped back. "What do we do now?" Laura asked softly. Keith seemed to consider the question for a long moment. Then, to Lance's surprise, Keith turned to him. "These are your people," he said. "You know them best. What do you think we should do, Lance?" Lance looked from Keith's trusting gaze to Alora's kind smile. He glanced over the other two. The woman still looked understandably upset, but didn't seem to care one way or the other. Finally, Lance's eyes fell on his gray uncle, who he had looked up to his whole life, and who had lied to everyone Lance cared about. "We'll tell them," he said firmly. "They have the right to know." Everyone took the news of the Blue Lion's disappearance about as well as expected. They told Princess Luxia first, to see how she wanted to handle the situation, since she would probably have to immediately take the throne once Baku's actions came to light. Lance had been prepared to argue with his cousin, should she wish to keep it a secret like her father, but thankfully that wasn't necessary. Once Luxia had gotten over her initial shock, she tore the chief a new one and called for a public council meeting to tell the people what had happened. Despite the circumstances, Lance felt a surge of pride as he watched Luxia address her subjects. Keith, Alora, and Lance stood behind her on a large stage in support. The citizens of the Northern Water Tribe were dismayed at the announcement of the missing lion and angry that their chief had lied to everyone, but Luxia assuaged the crowd enough to avoid any violence. She was going to make a great leader. "Please, everyone," she said over the noise. "I know you are hurting. Believe me, I feel the same. But the best we can do right now is have faith that the Blue Lion will return. I have already started an investigation, and Avatar Keith has promised his assistance as well. At her gesture, Keith stepped forward. As many of you know, the White Lion vanished from the Air Nation several years ago. He told the hushed audience, "My companions and I have been searching for her. That's why we came here, to see if the Blue Lion could help. But now the Blue Lion is gone too. Something big is happening, and I'm going to find out what." Keith stared out at the crowd, his eyes filled with determination. "I swear to you, I will do everything in my power to find both lions and bring them home." Once the crowd had dispersed, Keith, Lance, and Alora walked off the stage to where the rest of their friends waited. Eyes still hard, Keith stopped in front of the woman they fought at the temple. In all the drama with his uncle and the lion, Lance had nearly forgotten about her. She had barely said a word since then, other than a terse, "My name is Crolia," but it stuck with their group. "I think you owe us some answers," Keith said, arms crossed. Crolia regarded him for a moment and nodded. "Is there somewhere more private we can go? The information I have is extremely sensitive." Keith exchanged glances with his friends. "Let's go back to my rooms," he decided. "We can hear what you have to say and then regroup and think of a new plan." "Lead the way." As they trekked back to the hall where their quarters were located, Lance noticed Keith's disquieted expression. He gave the Avatar a gentle nudge with his elbow. "Hey, man." Lance smiled when Keith looked up. "You did great out there. I know you're still getting used to being in the public eye, but I think you helped a lot of people feel less scared about the whole thing." Keith offered a weak smile in return. "Thanks, Lance. That's nice of you to say." "Don't worry, we got this." Lance slung an arm over his boyfriend's shoulders, pleased when Keith shuffled closer. "We're already looking for one lion. What's one more, right?" Keith's small smile slipped away, and his eyes fell onto the ground. "That's not the whole reason why I'm upset," he admitted. After a moment, his gaze flicked back up to glance behind them. Lance followed his line of sight to see Crolia already looking back at them. Keith quickly turned away, but Lance held her gaze. She didn't seem angry, like he had initially thought, but more uncertain. Her eyebrows furrowed like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Once again, Lance was struck with a sense of déjà vu. The expression seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. Lance turned back to Keith. "So, do you guys know each other or something?" Their interaction had been pretty weird once Crowley unmasked herself. Keith shrugged cagely. "I'm not really sure," he said as he opened the door to his rooms, "but I guess I'm about to find out." Lance pondered what Keith meant by that as everyone filtered inside. They had all been given nice accommodations, but as the Avatar, Keith's suite was even bigger than Lance's. Not that Lance really used his anyway, since he snuck into Keith's bed every night, and the common area was more than spacious enough to fit everyone comfortably. Cosmo, who had apparently been napping on one of the plush armchairs, perked up and jumped into Keith's arms with an excited bark. The Star Wolf licked Keith's frown away, replaced by giggles. Lance watched in delight. Keith rarely laughed, and Lance had never heard him giggle before. Seeing everyone's amused grins, even Crowley was hiding a smile. Keith flushed and set Cosmo down. "So," he cleared his throat. Let's get started." He turned his attention to Crolia. "Why were you guarding the Blue Lion? It obviously wasn't under Baku's orders." Crolia's mirth faded and she straightened her shoulders. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room," she warned. She swept her gaze over the room to look everyone in the eyes one by one. Finally satisfied, she said, "I'm part of a secret organization called the Blade of Marmora. We're an elite force of firebenders that specialize in covert operations." "Spies," Pidge translated. "Wait," Lance frowned. "I didn't see you bend any fire." Crowley nodded again. "My assignment prohibits me from using firebending unless absolutely necessary. If my cover was blown and people saw that I was a firebender, they could use my presence as an excuse for war." "If you're all Fire Nation, does that mean you work for Zarkon?" Alora asked, with pursed lips. It was no secret she disliked the Fire Lord. Crowley adopted a similar pinched expression. "No," she said firmly. "The Blade is not affiliated with the monarchy unless we choose to be, which is not the case with Zarkon." "What?" "The Blade has existed for generations, working in the shadows to support the Fire Nation's best interest. Sometimes our ideals overlap with the will of the royal family, but not always. Since taking the throne, Zarkon has proven many times over that he cares more about power than the safety of his subjects. The blade serves the people, not the crown. Wait. Lance pinched the bridge of his nose as he tried to make sense of all of this. I still don't get what any of this has to do with the Blue Lion. Though our primary objective is to protect the Fire Nation, a part of that protection extends to the rest of the world, as the Fire Nation is part of the bigger world. When the White Lion vanished, the Blade assigned agents to watch over the remaining lions to try and prevent it from happening again. The lions are integral to keeping balance. Just in the last few years, there has been an uprising of chaos and evil spirits. Lance thought back to the parasite that corrupted the Balmera and grimaced. That being said, Crowley added, more recent sources have suggested Firelord Zarkon may have had some involvement with the White Lion's disappearance. We have yet to confirm anything. However, nor do we have any idea why he might want the other lions. So for now, our mission has remained the same. Or, well, she scowled. It was until now. Lance crossed his arms with a hum. Alora, Queen Sonda, and now an entire rebel group all suspected Zarkon. Surely that meant something. He turned to ask Keith for his opinion and paused. The Avatar's head was bowed, his bangs hiding his expression. So that's what you've been doing all these years? Keith asked quietly. Crowley's eyes softened. Keith, she said, I owe you an apology. Please believe me when I say I never wanted to leave you or your father. What? Keith raised his head, his own eyes, which Lance now realized were identical to hers. How did he not notice that earlier? Filled with warning, apprehension, and hope. Then you really are. Yes, Keith, Crowley said, I'm your mother. Holy shit. Somehow this feels like an even bigger revelation than the secret spy thing. Now that Lance was looking at it, it was obvious. Even without knowing what Keith's dad had looked like, Lance could tell that Keith clearly took after his mom. They had the same eyes, the same facial features, the same jet black hair. Honestly, the biggest difference apart from age and gender was that Crowley was much taller than average, a trait Keith apparently hadn't inherited. Keith lowered his gaze once more, steadfastly avoiding eye contact with his friends. Everyone looked just as freaked out as Lance felt, but appeared equally unsure if they should give the firebender privacy or stay to offer support. Luckily, Karan came to the rescue. Well, this was certainly an enlightening conversation, he chirped. I say we all go have a break over dinner and then pick this back up later. He quickly began to corral everyone out of the room, except for Keith and Crowley. I'm sure you two are quite tired after last night, so if you prefer, we can have dinner sent up here for you, he offered. Lance's eyes widened a fraction as he realized what Karan was up to. After all, Lance and Alora had been in the battle as well, but Karan was obviously giving Keith and Crowley the option for a private chat if they so choose. Crowley looked at Keith, deferring the choice to him. After a moment, Keith nodded. That'll be great, Karan. Thanks. Of course. Karan shooed everyone into the hall, but not before Shuro gave Keith a pat on the shoulder, and Lance managed to give Keith's hand an encouraging squeeze. Once the door shut, everyone stopped and exchanged glances. Karan once again swooped in. Now, let's not dally. The dining hall is this way. Lance shot one last wish of good luck at Keith and followed his friends. Keith gave the door a fondly exasperated look before turning back to Crowley. A few moments of awkward silence passed, neither quite knowing where to start. Finally, Keith swallowed dryly and opened his mouth. You said you didn't want to leave. That's right, she nodded. Why did you? Keith mumbled. Leave, I mean. It's a long story. We've got time. Crowley sighed and sat down on the small sofa. Keith sank onto the adjacent armchair, and Cosmo immediately hopped into his lap. Keith gratefully distracted himself by running his fingers over the wolf pup's fur in a soothing rhythm. I wasn't much older than you are now when the Blade recruited me. Once I completed my training, they assigned me to the capital. Hey, I need a refill over here. Coming right up, sir, Crowley replied brightly. Spirit, she hated this assignment. She'd been working undercover as a server at the Dancing Dragon for over a month now. The tea shop was nestled in the heart of the capital and a favorite of many soldiers and officials who worked in the palace. Combined with the people's tendency to ignore the working class, it was an ideal place for a spy to gather intel. It was also horrendously boring. Still, Corellia was a professional and didn't let her smile slip even the tiniest bit as she brought a fresh pot to pour into the waiting customer's cup. "Thanks, darling." The man, a royal guard judging by his uniform, leered up at her. Corellia quashed the urge to punch him in the nose and asked, "Anything else I can do for you?" "I think that's all for now." He glanced at the other soldier sitting across from him. "You need anything, Akira?" His companion, Akira, gave Corellia a strained but much more polite smile as and shook his head. "I'm fine, thanks." Corellia nodded and returned to the back room with their empty dishes. After a moment, she surreptitiously peeked through the curtains. "What you looking at?" Corellia glanced down at her coworker, Momo. If Momo had been hoping to startle Corellia by sneaking up on her, she was disappointed, as Corellia didn't even flinch. At Momo's pout, Corellia decided to humor her. "That man," she pointed over to Akira. "This is the 7th time in 2 weeks he's visited our shop." "So? We have customers that come here every day." "Yes, but this one always brings a different coworker with him. I don't think he even likes the one he's with today. It's weird. And he always sits in my section, even when I have a different one than usual." Corellia furrowed her eyebrows. Could he somehow know she was a spy? She caught him looking at her an awful lot. A giggle interrupted her thoughts, and she looked down to see Momo hunched over with her hands covering her face to stifle her laughter. "What's so funny?" You are Lee." Momo devolved into more snickering at Corellia's blank expression. "He likes you, dummy." Corellia's gaze snapped back to Akira. Could that really be it? She hadn't even considered that as a possibility, but it might explain the man's strange behavior. Akira looked up and caught her gaze. Corellia watched as a bashful expression crossed over his face, and he averted his eyes with a faint blush. "Huh. Aw, he's shy," Momo cooed. "That's probably why he keeps bringing people with him." She shot Corellia a sly glance. "So?" Corellia blinked back at her. "So what?" Momo rolled her eyes. "Are you going to talk to him?" Corellia frowned as she considered. On one hand, she didn't really have the time or interest in romance right now. A relationship would be distracting at best and dangerous at worst. On the other hand, getting close to a royal guard could get her access to more information than what she could gather from working shifts at the Dancing Dragon or her occasional nighttime reconnaissance. Corellia's eyes slipped down to meet Momo's. "Got any advice?" "Wait," Keith interrupted. "You started dating Dad to con information out of him?" "In the beginning, yes," Corellia admitted, "but things changed once I got to know him." Akira, it turned out, had indeed been frequenting the tea shop due to a romantic interest in Corellia, and was amusingly caught off guard when she approached him first. It started off rather awkwardly. Corellia had never been very inclined towards romance, so she didn't really know how to go about it, and Akira floundered for a bit as well. However, after a while, they fell into an easy routine. Akira would visit her shop almost every day, alone, and Corellia would take her breaks so they could chat. Initially, Corellia thought Akira would be timid or shy based on his previous behavior, but she soon discovered that wasn't the case. Akira was level-headed and patient, but by no means meek. After some prodding, he admitted he only got like that when it came to new romance, his cheeks aflame under the large hand covering half his face. Corellia was surprised to find it cute. "I fell in love." Corellia smiled wryly. "A few years later, we were married and had you. It was the happiest I'd ever been." Keith looked into his mother's wistful eyes. "Then why did you leave?" "There was a mission," she said. "It went wrong. I was compromised. I think your father had a heart attack when I turned home so badly injured." She chuckled. Corellia stumbled through the window she had left unlocked earlier, her hand clutching the wound on her side. "Lee, is that you?" Akira's voice grew louder as he came into the bedroom. "Where have you been? I've been worried sick." Corellia heard a sharp intake of breath, and a second later Akira was at her side, gingerly examining the large gash across her ribs. "What happened?" he demanded. When Corellia merely shook her head, Akira's eyes hardened, and he left the room. For an irrational second, Corellia worried he had left her for good. She had been keeping secrets from him for years now, and this was the final straw. But before she could spiral any further, her husband returned, medical supplies in hand. She let out a breath of relief as he led her to the bed to sit so he could tend to the wound. Once he was done patching her up, Akira looked at her expectantly. Corlia sighed. "My name isn't Lee," she said. "It's Corlia. I work for a group called the Blade of Marmora." He took the news surprisingly well, Corlia mused. I think a part of him knew. Maybe not that I was a spy, but he knew I was hiding something big. I'd always feared that if Akira found out about the blade, he'd ask me to leave. Instead, he did the opposite. "Corlia, please, don't go," Akira pleaded. "We can figure something out." Corlia shook her head as she stroked her sleeping son's hair. "They saw my face, Akira," she said. "I made sure they didn't follow me back, but they might recognize me if they come looking. I can't risk your and Keith's safety." "I won't." "Then we'll go with you," he insisted. "We'll start a new life somewhere else together." "It would still be too dangerous, and besides, you have a whole life here, a good job. I can't ask you to give that all up." "You're not asking, I'm offering. All I care about is you and our son." "Then think of Keith. Maybe we could support ourselves if we went on the run, but a baby? He needs food, clothes, a warm place to sleep. He needs stability. You can give him all those things here, even without me." "Corlia," Akira implored. "I'm sorry. I've already asked the Blade to reassign me somewhere far away." Corlia gently set Keith down into his crib and turned back to her husband. She brought her hand up to cup his face, and her heart broke a little more when he placed his own hand over hers and leaned into her palm. "I'll come back," she promised. "As soon as it's safe, I'll come back." "Where did you go?" Keith asked. "Ba Sing Se," Corlia replied. "It's easy to disappear in such a large city, and there was plenty of work to do. Still, in over 10 years, not a day went by that I didn't think about you or your father. Then, finally, I received word that those looking for me were gone, and it was safe to return to the Fire Nation." She closed her eyes, but I was too late. Corlia stared uncomprehendingly at the person who had answered the door. "Can I help you?" he repeated, annoyance tinging his voice. "I'm sorry," Corlia said, finally snapping out of it. "I'm looking for someone who used to live here. A father and a son?" "Oh, them." The man scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the father died about 6 years ago. Some accident, I think." Corlia felt like an icy hand had grasped her heart and squeezed. It couldn't be true. Akira said he would wait for her. He would never break a promise. "And his son?" she asked through numb lips. The man shrugged. "If he didn't have any other family, they probably took him to the orphanage. I can give you directions if you like." Corlia shook her head, still in shock. "No, I know where it is," she said, and slowly turned away. A sympathetic look crossed the man's face. "My condolences for your loss." Corlia didn't answer as she made her way down the street. "I went to the orphanage, but you weren't there, and no one knew where you'd gone." "I ran away a few years before that," Keith said. He fiddled with the long, fluffy fur that ran down Cosmo's spine. "So you couldn't find me, and then just left?" "No, Keith." Corlia held his gaze. "I would have kept looking for you for the rest of my life if I had to. It took time and many of my connections, but I did manage to track you down." Her eyes lowered to the ground. "But I was too late. Again." Corlia watched from a safe distance away as a 13-year-old Keith chattered amicably with a young man over dinner. The man, who Corlia had learned was named Takashi Shirogane, poked teasingly at Keith with his chopsticks. Keith scowled and swatted them away, prompting a boisterous laugh from the older firebender. Keith rolled his eyes, but couldn't hide the wide grin that spread on his face. Corlia took a long look at her beautiful son, who had grown up so strong without her, and burned his image into her mind. Then she turned and walked away. "You already had a new family," Corlia said with a sad smile, "and I could tell you how happy you were together. I didn't want to risk ruining that, especially since I was still working with the Blade, so I asked for a new assignment, and they sent me here." They lapsed into silence for a moment before Corlia let out a weak chuckle. "You know," she said, "the ironic part is that if I had known back then that you were the Avatar, the Blade would probably have ordered me to stay with you, or at least assigned another agent to watch over you." Keith wasn't sure how to respond, so he continued to stroke Cosmo's fur. "I know this is a lot to process," she said gently, "and I'm still reeling myself. I always figured that maybe one day, when my mission was complete, I might return to the Fire Nation and find you again, and maybe, if I was lucky, you'd be willing to let me be a part of your life. I never expected you to find me, and especially not here." Corellia tried to catch his eye, but Keith kept his gaze focused on his pet wolf. "Keith?" Keith abruptly stood up, setting Cosmo on the ground. "I think I'm actually gonna..." Keith jerked his thumb at the door. "Go get dinner after all." "Oh." Corellia looked disappointed but accepting. Keith took a step, paused, and turned back. "We can talk more tomorrow," he added haltingly. I just need some time to think." Corellia's eyes regained a modicum of hope, and she nodded. "Of course," she said. They exchanged one last awkward smile, and Keith walked out of the room, Cosmo trotting loyally at his heels.